We will begin our program. Thanks again for being with us, and I'm proud to introduce to you Nathan Canestaro, who is a professional intelligence officer with 25 years of federal service. During his family research on his family tree, he came across his grandfather's service during World War II, and that led to, and he will tell you how, studying the story of the USS Cowpens and her crew, and that led to this book. He has been writing about military operations for policymakers in the U.S. government for years and translated that experience into this book, which is something you want to have. He has his degree from the University of Tennessee, has a law degree from Georgetown, and a master in international relations from Yale, and lives with his family outside of Washington, D.C. Pleased to have Nathan come up and join us. Thank you, Nathan, for being with us.
It's great to be here at the Points Club, a little better for audio there. Always appreciate the warm welcome and an opportunity to tell a bit of a local story and local history that many folks don't know much about. Okay, so here I am, just a little bit more on my background before we dive into the ship itself. I'm the author of The Mighty Moo. It was just published this past June by Hachette or Grand Central. I'm a 25-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm currently on assignment to the National Intelligence Council in Washington. I've served overseas, mostly in Iraq, but a variety of other garden spots in the Middle East. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Which button? Just the.
Go forward,
okay. Oh, very good. Thank you. Okay. Served overseas during the War on Terror, mostly Iraq, but a few other garden places in the Middle East. We mentioned schools, Tennessee, Georgetown, and Yale. But most importantly, for the purposes of this story, the reason why I'm here is I'm a grandson of a Cowpens veteran. My grandfather served aboard from mid-44 until about February 45, and I'll get into a little bit of the story and how he fits into it. So let me ask a very direct question. Why do we care about World War II? It's been 80 years. Most of the veterans of that war have sadly passed on, but yet the war still holds a really powerful, important place in the American cultural landscape. And I put a few recent movies and TV shows, some of the icons up here: Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, The Masters of the Air, just this past spring. You get on Amazon and there were over 70,000 books written about World War II. Countless movies, TV shows, and video games. What is it about this conflict that still speaks to us all these years later? And I've highlighted a few reasons before we get into the story. And one is it is a tremendous, in the 21st century, in our divided times, there's a lot about the 1940s that it's easy to admire. This was, well, first off, we talk about the greatest generation. They weren't perfect. The 1940s had their flaws, but they had a real sense of national unity. When Americans, regardless of their differences, where they come from, their political stripes, whatever, they all set that aside to work together for a common cause. And secondly, this sort of sense of moral clarity. There was a clear distinction between good and evil. It seems like today, oftentimes we live in a world of shades of gray, and that just wasn't the case in the 1940s. We believed in what we were doing. So from our modern eyes, it's easy to look at this and go, wow. Secondly, and particularly in my case, is many people are drawn to this war because they had relatives that served. If you had family in the United States in the 1940s, odds are someone you're related to either served or supported the war effort in one way or another. So of a population of 132 million at the beginning of the war, 12.5 million Americans served in uniforms. That's about 10% of the total population. But if you narrow that down to sort of military-aged males, men 30 to 40, 35% served in uniform. If you lower that to 18 to 29, that's 45%. And then 25% more for both age groups served in industry, building tanks and airplanes and doing the things that they needed to do to support the war. So 2/3 of the American male population was involved in this conflict. And then you compare that to where we are today, less than 3% of men and less than 1% of women. So a tremendous period of national service. And I said I came to the Cowpens story trying to learn about my grandfather who served aboard in 1944. I couldn't do a presentation without one picture of Grandpa. He's on the left here. That's my grandfather, and the man to his right is my great-grandfather, his father. And a little bit of a story. Great-grandpa was a destroyer man in World War I, so I'm 3 generations Navy, going all the way back to the First World War. But he and my grandfather were estranged, and they hadn't spoken in many years. And my grandfather enlisted in the Navy and came to Pearl Harbor to join the USS Cowpens, and he was walking down a pier. His last name was Todd, and someone yelled out, "Hey, Toddy," and 2 men turned to see who yelled, and it was him and his father. And they had this chance meeting on the pier in Waikiki in 1944. So another reason perhaps why World War II suddenly is very relevant is there are very eerie similarities to the pre-war era that we sort of see in our modern world. There's a war in Europe, there's a revisionist power in the East, in China. The U.S. is much more interested in Asia and the Pacific than we have been in recent years. The West, not only the United States, but most of Europe, is doing its best to rebuild its defense industrial capacity, building weapons and missiles and bombs in a way that we haven't done in a long time. And then here at home, there are debates on what is the role of the United States in the world today. Are we an internationalist power? Are we more isolationist? How involved should we be? This is all straight out of 1939. Now, I'm not going to tell you that we're headed towards World War III, God forbid. And I quoted Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It certainly adds a new bit of relevance to something that happened 80 years ago. And the cartoon on the left is a Dutch cartoon from 1939, the old man of 1939 telling the new year of 1940. Now you handle this. So finally, inspiring stories. War is a tremendous tragedy. But from that, you get absolutely amazing stories of courage and sacrifice and honor. And as I was researching my grandfather's story, I came across this about the USS Cowpens, which has turned into the book. And I'll talk about each of these items sort of in turn. But the USS Cowpens was a ship that the Navy really didn't initially want. The captain barely avoided being scapegoated for loss of his first command. The pilot self-trained in the planes they would fly into battle. The crew had been in uniform barely longer than the ship had been afloat, and it suffered from an early jinx, survived a deadly hurricane, and yet somehow, at the end of all of this, it was the only U.S. aircraft carrier in Tokyo Bay to witness the Japanese surrender. So it's a heck of an underdog story from a ship that, honestly, no one expected that much from. So let me start you off. One of the things that made the USS Cowpens story unique was it was never intended to be an aircraft carrier at all. And in fact, there was a whole class of these ships called the Independence class, of which the Cowpens was one, that was built from the hull of a light cruiser. Now, it sort of begs the question, why would the Navy take a light cruiser and put a carrier deck on it? And the simple answer to that is they were desperate. Things were not going well for the U.S. Navy and the United States in that first year of the war. Over the course of 1942, 6 U.S. aircraft carriers served in the Pacific and 4 were lost to enemy action. In fact, it was so bad, so desperate, that we're down to 2. We were down to Saratoga and Enterprise, and both were damaged. The U.S. actually went to the British and said, hey, can you loan us an aircraft carrier for a few months so we can send Enterprise into dry dock and get her patched up? That's how desperate things had become. The Navy was building these big Essex-class carriers. Now, when you think of World War II aircraft carriers, Essex is what you're thinking of. There's one in New York City, the Intrepid. There's one here in South Carolina. There's another in Alabama, and a few others around the country. But they were big, they were slow to build, and they weren't being built in sufficient numbers to replace battle losses until late 43 or early 44. So the Navy had this gap. They had the carriers that they needed right now that had been lost, and they had the big carriers coming later, and they just needed something in the middle to sort of hold the tide until essentially the fleet carriers became available. And so President Roosevelt, who was no stranger to the Navy, he'd actually been the number 2 man in the Navy during the First World War, he went back to the Navy and said, hey, we need more carriers. And they had bought a series, several dozen of these Cleveland-class cruisers. You can see them up top. He says, we've already paid for these. They're already under construction. Why don't we just put a flat top on them? And they can kind of hold the line. And the Navy told him no. This came as a sort of a shock to me. I thought usually when the president tells you to do something, you follow the orders. But they didn't appreciate Roosevelt's meddling in their business. So he had to take a second run at them. And finally they said, okay, we'll do it. So they gave him one ship, the Independence. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And then every time they lost a big carrier, a fleet carrier, they'd queue up 2 or 3 of these smaller ones as replacements. And there were 9 in all. Cowpens was the 4th. And they're sort of an overlooked part of the war, but they were the right ships at the right time, and they not only filled the gap, but at the critical battle of the war for naval aviation, which is the Marianas Turkey Shoot, 80 years ago this past month in June, half of the U.S. carrier decks in that battle were these little Independence-class carriers. And 2 presidents served aboard Independence-class carriers. Gerald Ford served aboard the Monterey, and George H.W. Bush served aboard the San Jacinto. So a tremendous amount of history here, but kind of a little bit overlooked. Now, these were not great ships. Let's be honest. They had a number of things that were going against them. First off, they were small, and you get a sense of the width of the flight deck. That's 73 feet from one side of the flight deck to the next. The Hellcat fighters, we'll talk about those here in a minute, that landed on them had a wingspan of 42 feet, and the Avengers, the little larger torpedo bombers, had a 54-foot wingspan. So you're talking about these guys coming in, and they just have 10, 12, 15 feet on either side. And oh, by the way, the island was 6 feet wide. So it's one pilot landing on it. He said it's like hitting a lightning bolt or hitting a needle with a lightning bolt. It was a very, very difficult landing to make. As a result, they had one of the highest accident rates in the fleet. This is a dangerous ship to fly from. They had a very high center of gravity. The flight deck was, the hull of the light cruiser was pretty much unchanged, and they just put a flat top on top of it. So it was fairly tippy, shall we say. It was prone to roll in high seas. And this becomes important in the later part of our story. The other thing is, because it was, again, not designed to have a flat top up top, they put the island, which is the little, sort of the command center there, and it made it lean to one side. So they put several dozen tons of concrete over on the other side of the ship to try and even it out. But even still, it had a 4 to 6 degree list when the tanks were empty. They could even that out if by moving fuel from one tank to the other, but there was a cartoon in the ship's paper about 2 Cowpens sailors walking down the street in Pearl Harbor, and they both had a compensating list to port, and their confused date said, well, he says his ship has a starboard list. They were also very crowded. The Cleveland-class ships were built for 1,300. They put 1,500 guys aboard this thing. So even by Navy standards, these guys were cramped, packed in there like sardines. 33 planes in compared to the big carriers, about 100. But the thing that they had going for them was that they were fast. They had the cruiser hull, they had four screws, they could do 31 knots, which basically meant that they could keep up with the big carriers when they were doing their raids across the Pacific. And they were also very quick to build. So again, back to the idea that this was a desperate expedient, just something to hold the line until the big carriers come along. By the way, you can get it, if you look at the photo, you get a sense of Cowpens' list. Her tanks are empty here. She's a little bit to starboard. Okay, so as an aircraft carrier, her primary weapons are her aircraft. And there were only 2 types of aircraft aboard, fighters and torpedo bombers. This is both of them here. 24 of these F-6F Hellcats made by Grumman in Long Island. More American fighter aces flew the Hellcat than any other aircraft in World War II. They were a fantastic aircraft. They were very easy to fly, very forgiving, heavily armored, rugged, self-fueling fuel tanks, resistant to battle damage. People loved this, who flew it loved this aircraft. Overall, over the course of the war, 19-to-1 kill ratio. So for every Hellcat lost in battle, they shot down 19 Japanese planes. 5,200 aerial victories in all. So very, very successful aircraft. Its primary weapon has 6 50 caliber guns with 400 rounds per gun. And that gets you about 30 seconds of fire. And I'm going to give you an example of a fighter ace who did an awful lot with his 30 seconds of fire, but it's sort of a testament to the skill and the marksmanship of some of these pilots. They would come home from a mission with sometimes 3, 4, 5, sometimes even as much as 7 aerial kills with 30 seconds of fire. They were also kind of a utility infielder of an aircraft. As the war went on, they'd put bombs and rockets on them, and there wasn't a whole lot they couldn't do. They were a pretty capable aircraft. So the next one down is the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. By the way, this is the plane that George H.W. Bush flew from the San Jacinto. It was designed to haul the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, which sadly was kind of a piece of junk. At the beginning of the war, it was badly flawed, and it honestly took them until about 1944 to iron out the wrinkles in it. But in the meantime, it was very good at doing a lot of other things in terms of carrying bombs and depth charges and running patrol. So it was an all-purpose scout and bomber. It was a forgiving aircraft to fly. It was a little underpowered. The fighter pilots called it the turkey. Not exactly a bird that you look to as an inspiring flyer. They also called its pilots the torpeckers. So I'll leave that one alone. You know, they kind of made fun of them for flying sort of an ungainly aircraft. Also made by Grumman. Actually, and some of them were also made by General Motors in Detroit. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit about the Cowpens jinx here in a minute, but if you have to go looking for why did this ship start with a streak of bad luck, perhaps the place to start is this guy, and his name is Robert P. McConnell, and he was the ship's first captain. This crew called him Captain Mac. He was very popular. His men said he was a real gentleman, just very gregarious and really did care about their welfare, but he had a bit of a rough start. He was a Mustang. He came up from the enlisted ranks. He dropped out of the University of California just as World War I started and joined the Navy, and going from enlisted to officer in our day and age doesn't seem like a big deal, but in the interwar period, it was a very big deal. The Navy was under a lot of pressure to keep its numbers low, and so essentially an officer's career prospects were linked to a series of sort of his pedigree, starting with his Naval Academy degree, and he did not have a Naval Academy degree. So he worked his way up to captain without one, which is a sort of a testament not only to his skill, but his perseverance. So he was given a ship called the Langley, based out of Manila in the Philippines when the war started in early 1942. It had started as our nation's first aircraft carrier, but by the time he got it, it was a seaplane tender. So essentially it was a floating garage for seaplanes, and they would travel around and pick up these planes and repair them. He was given, I don't want to exaggerate, but it was essentially a suicide mission as the war started. He was given a load of P-40 fighter planes, which he couldn't fly off his deck. They were just loaded on, and told to go to Java on the eve of Java's capture by the Japanese. And they were going to give these fighter planes to the Dutch. The Dutch were desperate for all the help they could get. And the only thing that he had very little in the way of defenses, and the only thing he had going for him was that the last 100 miles of the voyage was going to be done at night, so he could sort of sneak in, drop off the planes. The whole idea was pointless to begin with. The P-40s he was carrying were no match for the Japanese Zero, and even if they were, the Japanese had hundreds of Zeros and he had 40. So it was risking essentially everyone on board his ship for something that wouldn't accomplish anything. Oh, and the port he was delivering to did not have an airfield, so he was going to have to drop them off at the dock. But the roads in town weren't big enough for the planes to go through because they didn't have folding wings, so they're just going to have to knock the building down to make it. So I mean, the whole thing was poorly thought out to begin with. His superior officer micromanaged the journey, cost him the cover of darkness. The Japanese found him, hit his ship. It was a fire. It looked like it was capsizing. McConnell thought the Japanese were going to come back any minute. He ordered the abandoned ship, and they put several torpedoes into the Langley, but she wouldn't sink. One of his escorts did. So he goes, we got to get out of here. We got to save the men we've got, and he left. He and the survivors are then loaded aboard another ship called the Picos, which is also in turn sunk by the Japanese 4 days later. So poor Captain McConnell went into the water twice in a week. And then when he gets back to Australia, his superior commander, the one who micromanaged his mission, blames him for abandoning his ship prematurely. And it was only by the intercession of Admiral King, who's the chief of naval operations and the #1 man in the Navy at the time, was his record cleared, and he was allowed to take command of the Cowpens. So a bit of a rough start for Captain Mac. So I talked a little bit about the crew and how inexperienced they were. The Cowpens was not the Navy's elite. If you were a Naval Academy grad, if you had a lot of experience someplace else, if you were top of your field, you're going to be assigned to one of the big fleet carriers. This was largely a crew of reservists. So that meant that most of the crew were 17 to 18 years old, fresh out of boot camp, never been to sea before. Most of them had volunteered for the Navy to avoid being drafted into the infantry. I've talked to a lot of Navy veterans, and they all say the same thing. Yes, I wanted to serve, but I talked to my dad, and he was in World War I, and he said, you don't want to be in the trenches. So the idea with the Navy is what they called it, you get 3 hots and a cot. You know, you took your meals and your chow with you. And also the Navy encouraged this. Actually, they would allow you to enlist in the Navy even once you'd gotten the letter in the mail that said you've been drafted in the Army. You just have to march down to the naval office and they'd take you anyway. So the pilots were the old men aboard. They were 21 to 23 years old. They had 2 to 4 years of college. There were very few Naval Academy aboards, or honestly, anyone over the age of 30. The handful of folks who were all Captain McConnell and his very senior crew, probably just a couple dozen out of a crew of almost 1,500 people. So, kids. To give a sense of sort of the lack of experience, and I know we have a carrier engineer in the background, the Cowpens chief engineer, the man responsible for operating its propulsion and power plants in the belly of the ship, had never operated any machinery on a ship before. He was actually a thermodynamics professor from Penn State. And they had to find a junior officer who had experience on another ship to help him figure out how it is you actually make the machinery. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. Also, on the pilots, the Cowpens' greatest fighter ace, and I'll get into him in a minute, was a former insurance salesman from Indianapolis. So a wide variety of civilian backgrounds. So the Cowpens jinx. Cowpens is sent out, leaves Philadelphia where she was put together, and starts doing her shakedown cruise, first in the Chesapeake and then in the Atlantic, and things start going badly for her. The air group was trained separately, so they join the ship in the Chesapeake. Their first landings aboard are a disaster. Almost half or 2/3 of the planes landing aboard crash, either blow tires or pancake on the deck. Poor guy goes over the side and is recovered. So not a great start. Then they go back to Norfolk and they get tangled in an anti-submarine net and they're hung there for 3 days, and the Navy has to come down with divers and free them, and they get a new propeller out of it, for which Captain McConnell receives an official slap on the wrist and admonishment from the Navy. Last thing he needs after barely dodging those allegations of dereliction of duty in his last command. Their first combat mission at Wake was incredibly bloody for such a small squadron. They lost 4 pilots killed in action, either due to shot down or accidents. 2 of those just took off from the ship and were never seen or heard from again. No one has any idea what happened. They may have collided, they may have gotten vertigo. 2 others, including the air group commander, were shot down and eventually recovered by submarine. So it was a bad start. And then Captain McConnell, the ship goes back to Pearl Harbor to rest, refit. He goes, my guys need some more exercise. They're doing training drills off the coast of Honolulu, and one of their escorting destroyers slices into the side and gives them that gash. If the collision had gone 10 feet to either side, they would have lost folks on board. There were berthing compartments on both sides. Sadly, the destroyer Abbott lost 6 men who were sleeping in the bow when it ran in. So it's at this point that the crew is starting to wonder, what have we gotten ourselves into? Is there a Cowpens jinx? Thankfully, this is as bad as it gets. And from there, her luck changes. By way of practice, by way of repetition, Cowpens turns into a real workhorse for the Navy's task force of fast carriers. A long string of operations, and the book goes into more detail, but just sort of a bucket list, Wake, Gilbert's, Marshall's, Truk, Marianas, and many others. Every time the pilots are just getting a little better and a little better and a little better. In 1944, they raided an island called Truk, which is in the Caroline Islands. At the time, it had a very ominous reputation as sort of a Japanese stronghold. No one, the Japanese had closed it off to Westerners for 20 years. And rumor has it, people, it was stocked with elite fighter pilots, and they called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. And U.S. Carrier Strike Force hit it and had a field day with it and sank an awful lot of Japanese shipping in a weekend, of which Cowpens bombed some airfields and sank a light cruiser, and casualties were fairly light. So for the guys who are newbies aboard the Cowpens, they gave them real confidence that, hey, we can take on Japanese bases, strongholds, and come out of it okay. It was a real confidence booster. And then in the Marianas, 80 years ago this past month, with the invasion of Saipan and Guam and Tinian, 20 aerial victories by the Cowpens over the course of a month. They had a good month, did an awful lot of flying, of which 12 were in the turkey shoot. This did, however, just the cumulative losses over time began to mount. Of the pilots that left Philadelphia in the summer of 43, 40% did not come home. So it was heavy losses. I will talk, here's one lucky escape, and then I'm going to hit one on the next slide. This is Lieutenant Alfred McGee, and he took off from the Cowpens, smelled fuel, thought he had a bit of a fuel leak, came around, and what he didn't know is there's this fireball trailing out from behind his aircraft. He landed, and the first thing he noticed was the flames suddenly caught up with his plane. And he just scampered across the wingtip of his fully loaded Hellcat, completely unharmed. Made it out okay, and then they pushed the plane over the side. So this was in Life magazine back home, which was a big day for the Cowpens. So speaking of lucky escapes, let me introduce you to Commander Bob Price. Here he is, and he was the first commander of the ship's fighter squadron, and then he went on to be commander of its air group, and then later came back as its air officer, which is kind of the intermediary between the captain and his crew and the air group. So in June 44, just this past month, 80 years ago, he was attacking a Japanese convoy along with several of his fellow fighter pilots off the Marianas, and his plane took a direct hit right in the engine from a Japanese anti-aircraft round. And the engine stopped completely, so he essentially not moving at all, and there are no ejection seats at the time, so he radios to his wingman, he says, "I'm going in," and makes a perfect water landing right in the middle of the Japanese convoy he was just attacking a moment ago. And he bailed out of his aircraft, which sank, and he did not get his raft, but he had his life jacket, and he hid under his life jacket as a Japanese destroyer came by to check, see if there's someone to pick up. He said they were so close that he could see the Japanese sailors in their white tropical shorts, lining the rails, but they didn't see him. It was late in the day, the sun was about to set, and his wingman circling overhead threw him a note and said, "We'll be back for you tomorrow. Good luck." Because they didn't generally fly at night. So first thing in the morning, true to their word, his wingmen go out looking for him. They find the place where the battle was, still a lot of wreckage, no Bob Price. So they fly back home, they search the area as best they can until they run out of fuel. They go home, they request permission up the chain of command, we want to go back out and find him. And the admiral in charge says, "Well, I need you on combat air patrol today, but I'm going to send another squadron." So they send another squadron, but they search in the wrong place. They don't account for his drift. So word gets back to the Cowpens, and they say, "Well, you guys searched in the wrong place. We need to go out and find this." Ask for it a third time, and permission is denied. So he was left essentially to the mercy of the sea. 10 days later, a friend of his on another carrier, a guy by the name of Tex McCrary, has a dream that Bob Price is alive and floating in the Pacific, waiting for someone to pick him up. And he tells his friend, who is sort of his admiral's flag lieutenant, sort of his right-hand man, "I really think this is true, but I don't know what to," and people think I'm nuts if I tell them this. And they say, "Well, you got to tell the admiral." So he tells the admiral, the guy by the name of Jocko Clark. And Jocko had a policy that he always tried to rescue his aviators, no matter how narrow the odds. And he tells him what the dream was, and so Jocko says, "Well, let's see where he might be." The two of them sit down with a map, they do the calculations of wind and current, and they figure out if he's still alive, he'd probably be about 100 miles out of their way. So the admiral proves the detour, and who should they find alive in his life raft after 11 days but Bob Price? Dehydrated, unharmed, and Jocko pinned the Purple Heart on him when he came back aboard Hornet. So there's more to Bob's story. I'll leave the book to sort of go into it, but a tremendous, tremendous individual. So very briefly, there's a rotation of squadrons here. The pilots would do 6 or 8 months aboard, and you'd get another batch. And the next batch is my grandfather's air group 22. And they did an awful lot of fighting in a very short period of time. The Navy was moving ever closer to Japan, and the battle for the Philippines was fiercely fought, hotly contested by the Japanese. And the carrier's job was essentially to move up and down the Philippines as far north as Taiwan and down as far south as New Guinea, hitting Japanese airfields and destroying planes that could be used to prevent American landings. So they were doing missions in the middle of October 1944 off Formosa, which is Taiwan. And the way sort of the ship it worked at the time was the carriers were the big targets. So they were at the center of the formation, and you had an outer ring of cruisers who protected them with their anti-aircraft guns, and then another ring outside of them of the destroyers, and the destroyers did the same. And late one evening, on the night of the 13th, Japanese fighters come in low and fast under the radar, just at the wave tops, make a run at the carriers, drop their torpedoes, and one torpedo passes immediately aft of the Cowpens, just a matter of feet, and strikes the USS Canberra, who's steaming one of her escorts to the port and just a little behind. And this is, by the way, a photo of the damage being done. You get sort of a sense of the hole in the side of the ship. Canberra is pulled out of the formation, and the Houston goes in the next day to fill that same spot. And then it happens again. Japanese fighters come in low and fast, under the radar, drop their torpedoes. A second torpedo passes immediately to the aft of the Cowpens and hits the Houston, steaming in Canberra's place. It had only just taken it twice before. So you have these two heavily damaged ships. You're 100 miles from Taiwan. There's countless enemy airfields on Taiwan. What do? Well, Admiral Halsey decides to use them for bait and to convince the Japanese to come out and fight. And who does he leave to provide air cover for these two wounded ships? Cowpens and her sister ship, the Cabot. And these two ships do eventually make it to safety, but over the several days, they fend off waves of fighters, and on the 15th, Cowpens shoots down 8, and the following day, she shoots down 9. So a pretty heavily contested withdrawal. By the way, the title here, one of the other ships that was guarding these two wounded, they were described as the bait group. That was actually their official target. And the captain on another cruiser says, well, now I know how a worm on a fishhook feels, that they were at the center of the tension. Okay, so I've talked to a lot of Cowpens veterans, including my grandfather, and also the Cowpens Veterans Association did a sort of a survey in the 1980s talking about people's experiences. And when asked to say, when were you most scared? It wasn't enemy action. It was this day. It was December 18th, 1944, when the Third Fleet, to include Cowpens, steamed into Typhoon Cobra. It's off the Philippines. Now, meteorology in the 1940s isn't the same as it is today. There's no satellite photography. There weren't a lot of weather stations all over the Pacific. So they knew a storm was coming, but they didn't know how far away it was or necessarily even in what direction it was coming from. And Admiral Halsey, you could argue it was his fault or it wasn't his fault, but essentially steamed the fleet right into the middle of the storm. Winds of 100 to 120 knots. I mentioned earlier the ship is a little tippy. She's a little top heavy, very high center of gravity. She was rolling more than 45 degrees to either side. So if you can, the photo here, that's the flight deck, which is 70 feet above the water in calm seas. There's her exhaust stacks. There's the ocean. They said men on the bridge, which you can kind of see in the background there, could actually reach out and touch the water as she rolled to starboard. My grandfather said so many people were getting hurt by sort of being the motion of the ship. The captain came on the PA and said, if you are not on duty, go to your bunks and tie yourself in, because they're just trying to reduce the number of casualties. Down in the magazine was filled with bombs to support General MacArthur, his advance in Leyte, and they broke loose from their moorings. So the 500-pound bombs apparently were bouncing around like tennis balls, and the 1,000-pound bombs, when they hit the side of the bulkhead, they did so with such force that the captain, 7 decks up, could feel the impact. So they actually got a bunch of volunteers, ordnance men, to go into this compartment as these things are rolling back and forth with a couple of miles of line to try and lasso the bombs and lash them into place. And the story of the of the storm said they could only do so for a couple of seconds when the ship was basically even. And then when it started to roll again, they'd jump up and grab the rafters and pull themselves up to avoid being crushed by these bombs. It took them 3 hours, but they did in fact get them all under control. Meanwhile, there's a fire on the flight deck. One of the fighters, which had been strapped down to weather the storm, broke loose, ended up in the catwalk, and was aflame and threatened to catch all the other planes on deck on fire. Again, more volunteers out onto the deck, and they said they were tying themselves like mountain climbers to the deck tie downs, going from one across the deck to get the fire hoses on the ship. It was eventually extinguished, but not without loss of life. There was, as I mentioned, there's the exhaust stacks, which were side-mounted. And the report from the day said that they were actually taking water down the exhaust stacks from the ocean. And it commented, normally government reports are pretty sterile, but the report said something to the effect of, when an aircraft carrier is shipping water down her stacks, God is near everyone on that vessel. So they knew their margin of error was very, very small. And to sort of, as evidence of that, 3 destroyers capsized in this storm, killed almost 800 men. 2 other destroyers rolled 70 to 75 degrees before righting themselves. So it was an incredibly costly event, and Admiral Halsey had a close brush with being court-martialed for his involvement in this particular incident. So absolutely terrifying from the veterans' perspectives. So I talked a little bit about guys who were great shots with those 400 rounds in their Hellcat. I wanted to introduce you to one. This is Lieutenant Clement Craig, or Clem. He was the Cowpens' greatest fighter ace. He was a pretty intense guy, not known for his sense of humor, very stern, very devoted to duty. Fantastic pilot. He finished the war with 12 and a half aerial kills and 2 Navy crosses. Went on to fly another 35 or 36 missions in Korea, so made a full career of the Navy. He was a former insurance agent from Providence Insurance Company in Indianapolis. On January 21st, Clem and 7 other Cowpens Hellcats were sent to investigate 4 bogies on radar, bogies being incoming Japanese plane. When they arrived on the scene, what looked to be 4 on radar turned out to be 18. So it was 8 Cowpens fighters versus 18 Japanese. Clem thought that was about even odds. And they shot them all but one down in 5 minutes. Clem came home with his guns dry, no ammunition remaining, and the gun camera footage to document that he'd shot down 5 of them. So he was, 5 is the threshold to become ace. He was one of the very few pilots in the Navy who could claim to be what they called an ace in a day. Okay, so I'm gonna flash forward a few months to the end of the war. August 1945, the Japanese, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese, and the Cowpens was out to sea, and there was a lot of, the Japanese had sort of engaged with the United States. They were starting to talk about the terms under which they might surrender, and there was a lot of hope aboard that the war would end without further bloodshed. But at the last moment, starting on August 13th, the war ends on the 15th, these men, this is Air Group 50, were assigned to attack an electronics plant in downtown Tokyo. And it was one of the most heavily defended sites in Japan. Another squadron had hit it earlier in the year and had taken so many casualties they called it Old Bloody. And it was supposed to be a low-level attack, so they didn't like their odds. But they were hopeful that the war would end before they actually had to hit this target. The 13th, they were weathered out. The weather was too bad to fly, so they didn't have to take off, relieved. 14th, they took off to find the target, but it was clouded over and they couldn't find it, so they hit another target. So 2 strikes, they're doing great. And then on the morning of the 15th, weather is clear and they're ordered to hit the plant. And people had gotten up that morning hoping that the final announcement would come in that they didn't have to fly this mission. And it didn't arrive in time. And so Cowpens pilots took off to go to the electric plant, and they were halfway there when the word reached them that the war was over. And this photo is in the National Archives in Washington. This is from the Air Group's ready room mere moments after the surrender was announced. I had the opportunity to talk to this guy right here. This is Frank Martinich. He was a tail gunner and a torpedo bomber. But these are men who know that they will live to see the end of the war. So just absolute joy. There was only one little problem, in that a lot of people in the U.S. Navy didn't necessarily believe the Japanese when they said they wanted to surrender. You have to remember that these were men that had been double-crossed once before at Pearl Harbor, and there was a lot of lingering resentment. And of course, the Japanese had, their record, shall we say, for war crimes was very well known. So there was a lot of fear that this was a trap, that the Japanese would invite the U.S. Navy into Tokyo Bay for a surrender and then swarm them with kamikazes and try and kill as many Americans as possible. So Admiral Halsey wanted to protect his big ships, his irreplaceable fleet carriers. But what he needed was a carrier that could go into Tokyo Bay who could sort of oversee it. And he settled on the Cowpens. So it is a bit of an irony that Cowpens' greatest moment of glory, the thing that she is best known for, she didn't earn it because her pilots were great or because of her sterling battle record. She earned it because she was expendable. Something that was not lost on the men aboard, one of which said he would rather occupy a den of porcupines than go into Tokyo Bay. So what happens next? 26 months this ship was in service, a remarkably short period of time, 211,000 miles steamed in that period, almost 11,275 carrier takeoffs, 93 planes destroyed in the air, 512 on the ground, 60 men killed overall. But the Navy has no need for these ships anymore. They only needed them in the beginning until the Essexes arrived, and now they had Essexes. I think they had 16 or 18 by the end of the war. So the Navy, after 26 months of service, puts these ships into mothballs, hardly uses them at all. It loans a few of them out to foreign navies, one of which, the Cabot, served in the Spanish Navy until 1989. But the rest were Cowpens was scrapped in 60, and her sisters not far after. If you want, Essexes you can go and see them. As I mentioned, there's one here in South Carolina and a few other places around the country. If you were looking to see a CVL, you can't. When Cabot came back to the United States, Presidents Bush and Ford tried to campaign for her preservation as a museum ship, and they couldn't make the money, and so she was scrapped. So there are only two places you can see. One is if you've not been to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, it's a fantastic museum, and they have a replica of Cabot's Island as it looked in 1945, and this is it, and they have the outline of her deck on the ground. I have not been up to Buffalo, but there's only one of the Cleveland-class ships on which she is based, the Little Rock, and that is there in Buffalo. That is about it. That being said, there are a lot of people who, particularly in this state, are trying to preserve its legacy. Now, Cowpens veterans started gathering in their namesake town of Cowpens, which is just down the road from here, in 1979, and they've been doing it almost every Father's Day since. There's only been 2 years that they haven't done it. One, it was just as they were getting going, and they had a break for COVID-19. And I was just there. It's a fantastic small town festival, and the veterans are the guests of honor. Sadly, this year there was only one World War II veteran in attendance. His name is Ray Williams, and that is him right there. He turned 100 years old for Father's Day this year. I've talked to all of these gentlemen, and sadly they've all passed. But the Navy has a second cruiser named Cowpens, and its veterans have been attending for 20 or 25 years now, and almost every year the Navy sends either the captain or several members of its crew as an attendee, which is completely unique in the Navy. There's no other ship in the Navy that has that kind of community relations. Sadly, again, the new Cowpens, is being decommissioned in August. And so the little town of Cowpens, I'm sure, will be, they've already started the lobbying and starting to talk about how is it that we make a third to carry the name on. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions okay. Well, thank you.